Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Matt Williams. I'm a tutor in politics and what is known as the Access Fellow here at Jesus College of the University of Oxford. Today we're going to talk about the admissions tests that we use for the University of Oxford. They are very similar, in some cases exactly the same as admissions tests used at Cambridge and other British universities, and indeed they're very similar to the SATs and LSATs that are used over in the US. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you my top tips for defeating, crushing these tests so that you feel more confident going into them. Okay, so let's dive in. Where should we start? I mean, fairly predictably, there are lots of resources available online for you to start off with. Lots of practice materials, lots of instructions, a lot of explanations, a lot of advice. So this is the Oxford University website that you can see here, with loads of details on all of the admissions tests that we use. Now, there's a good reason why we provide so much information, which is that we want you to perform at your best. We don't want you to fail and suffer and find this terribly unpleasant. We want you to do as well as possible, and that, of course, is also why I'm producing this video. So why do we use admissions tests, and how do we use them? And what are they? Well, they are, generally speaking, tests of your academic potential and your skill set. They're not so much tests of your knowledge, although some of the tests will assume a certain amount of knowledge. We use them because we have so many fantastic applicants from all over the world, and we need a fair basis for comparing those applicants. So it is another data point amongst many that we use. And how we use them is that, you can see an example here from the TSA test, which is the Thinking Skills Assessment. It's used for several of our degrees. We have everyone put into a frequency distribution like this, and then we divide people up into quartiles typically, so top 25%, second 25%, third, and so on. Those people that come in the top 25% are very, very likely to be invited for interview. In fact, we'd have to make a special case not to invite someone like that to interview. And those that come in second quartile or lower are much less likely to be called for interview, unless there's a good reason why we should invite them. So coming in that top quartile is an important predictor of who will ultimately be admitted to the university. It's important to note that we do take the data from admissions tests along with all other data, and we do spend about 20 person-hours on average on every application we receive, so we are looking holistically at your skill set, and we're not just going to rely solely on admissions test data, because that wouldn't be fair. Okay, sometimes stuff happens, life gets in the way, you might be horribly sick on the day of your test. There was one case I heard of where a young man who was taking the Thinking Skills Assessment had the wall fall down next to him while he was taking the test. Now that was obviously something that was way beyond his control. Obviously wouldn't have been reasonable for us to have taken that into consideration, so we didn't. It may be that you've suffered sustained educational disadvantages, you might have an illness, there might be other extenuating circumstances. Provided you communicate that with us, then we can take that all into consideration. So don't look on these tests as the be-all and end-all, but they are nonetheless important predictors of who tends to get admitted. Okay, how and when? Now it's important to figure out how to register for these tests, because each of the tests have their own sort of approaches to registration. In some cases you might be asked to pay a fee, so for the LNAT for law you may have to pay a fee, but there are bursaries available if you're from a poorer household in the UK. So do just check out what you need to do and by when in terms of registration. That's worth doing as early as possible, because you don't want to suddenly realise with days to go before the test is due to be taken that you're not ready to take it. So do make sure you look all of that up. All of the details on how to register are also on the university website. I'll link everything below so it's nice and easy for you to find. Okay, let's get into something a bit more practical. What should you do to prepare? Now, are these tests of your talent or tests of your skill? In other words, do these tests somehow gauge your natural acuity, and therefore you don't need to do anything? You just sort of rock up, take the test, and you'll be as good or bad as your talent has destined you to be? Or are these tests of your skill, and therefore diligence, practice, hard work will pay off? They are very strongly the latter category, okay? I mean, I actually don't really believe in talent. There's no strong genetic evidence for some sort of intelligence gene. You know, people are not by nature more intelligent than other people necessarily. There probably is a genetic component, but we have no positive empirical evidence for that. And so what role genes might play in someone's intelligence will be a very messy complication of genes, environment, biology, and so on. And so the upshot of all of that is that no, you should not assume you can just rock up, that your performance on the test is predestined by your genetics. It is very much the case that it's a test of your skill, and therefore if you prepare, you will be more skillful. Just as with any test ever devised by a human being, practice will make, not necessarily perfect, but will make you very, very good. Now, there are 3 P's to preparing yourself, which starts with physiological preparation. Now, this might sound like a slightly odd place to start, preparing yourself in body in order to take something that will stretch your mind, but there's a very interesting and important reason for this. Now, here's an example of a question from the TSA, from the Thinking Skills Assessment. Okay, and this is one of 50 multiple choice questions that you would be required to take in 90 minutes. And although this is just from one of the tests, it's quite representative of the types of questions that pop up in many of the other tests. The point I'm trying to make here is that's quite a lot you have to read, right? You have to read and comprehend and get your head around all of that verbiage and come up with the correct answer in 1 minute and 48 seconds, because you've got to answer 50 questions in 90 minutes. Now, you might be thinking, that's okay, I can cope with that, and you probably can. 1 minute 48 is probably just about enough to get through that. But once you've done those 1 minute 48 50 times, you're going to be fatigued, because that's just human nature, right? Your endurance will flag. And so these tests are quite significantly tests of your intellectual stamina and your capacity to keep the same sort of level of intellectual skill over a long period of time. And that is very significantly a function of your physiology. So in other words, how well rested are you? How well fed are you? How well watered are you? Those 3 things must not be neglected, because the margin of difference between being in that top quartile, that top 25%, or being in the second 25% is going to be a fraction of a percentage. It's going to be really, really tiny, razor thin difference. It's not going to be like there's a gulf between quartile 1 and quartile 2. And so if you're just a little bit better rested than someone else, and therefore you have greater intellectual stamina than they do, that could be it. That could be the difference, right? So you've got to make sure you take into consideration all of these variables, because they could matter. So getting good regular sleep is a good form of preparation for this test. Making sure that you're eating plenty of nutritious food as far as you're able to do so is very important preparation for this test. Your brain uses about 20 to 25% of your daily calories, even though it's about 2 or 3% of your body mass. So it needs fuel, especially if you're stretching it. And of course, you need to be hydrated, because if you're dehydrated, then your brain and all your other organs are basically on the slow process of starting to fail, and you don't want that in the middle of an exam. It's worth noting it's not a good idea to take sort of hyped up energy drinks just before the test either, because you'll go through some sort of epic crash. Good old-fashioned tea is probably sufficient stimulation before a test like this. All right, the second P stands for psychological. Prepare yourself psychologically. And what this means is that you need to manage your expectations quite carefully. These tests are really, really hard. And that's not because you're lacking in talent, because remember, this isn't really a test of your talent, it's a test of your skill. And skill is something you prepare for. It's not something that's etched into your genes, right? So this is not a test of your value as a human being. This is not a test of whether or not you will be a good person to have around in the labour market. This is just a really freaking hard test, okay? And the important upshot of that is that you must be kind to yourself in this process. You will find questions that are incredibly challenging, and that's because the questions are incredibly challenging. It's not because you're not Oxford material. It's not because you're a bad human being. It's not because you're stupid. None of those things will be correct. But a lot of people go into this and they psych themselves out. They say all of these sorts of destructive narratives about themselves. And of course that impairs their performance, because they're burning a lot of nervous energy, berating themselves for being so thick and incapable, when in fact all they need to do is to just keep going, put one foot in front of the other. So as you start to practice a few tests and past papers, you're going to get some questions wrong, and that's fine. That's natural. That's part of the learning process. Don't beat yourself up about it, okay? And don't expect to get full marks, because people don't ever get full marks on these tests. I've never seen it in the TSA, which is the test I'm most familiar with. And here's an example, the PAT, the physics admissions test. And again, it's just, as far as I'm aware, completely unheard of that people will get perfect scores on this test. So go into it trying to optimize your performance, but don't go into it with unrealistic expectations that you will be perfect, because you probably won't. And if you go in with that expectation, you will disappoint yourself and it will be quite upsetting. Okay, so prepare yourself psychologically. And then final P of preparation, of course, is practical. Practice, 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 right? I'm yet to meet an Oxford student who hasn't practiced as many past papers as they can get their hands on. It's just a fairly sort of obvious thing to do, but a lot of people are still convinced that these are not tests that you can practice for. We've got to make a careful distinction here. These are not tests you can revise for necessarily. There's not, in many cases, a curriculum of facts that you need to know, but there are skills, and you can hone your skills, and you will hone your skills with practice. And I'll explain specifically what sorts of practice will be most optimal shortly, but going through as many of the resources that are available online is an incredibly good idea. Okay, so next up, what about some strategies for the shorter answer questions? So most of these admissions tests have short answer questions, so questions that are relatively small number of marks where you might have to choose amongst multiple choices, or you might have to write in a short sort of response to a question. Okay, so the first, and again, fairly obvious thing to do is to go and seek some walkthroughs, some explanations. This is an example from the BMAT, which is used for medicine and biomedical sciences, and it explains the correct answers and the incorrect answers to some of the questions. So go through all of those is a very good idea. Probably best to try the test out first and then see where you went wrong, and not being scared of getting things wrong, because remember what I said earlier, this is a really hard test, and it's not a test of your value, it's not a test of whether or not you're a good person, it's just a really hard test. So going through some of those explainers is a good idea. I've also made walkthroughs for several of the more popular admissions tests that we use at Oxford, and I'll link all of those in the description. So BMAT, HAT for history, LNAT for law, TSA, we've got PAT as well. So go and find some resources, because people want to help you, right? We don't want you to struggle on your own. The next thing is that for some of the tests you will be expected to demonstrate some knowledge. It won't be knowledge that could not reasonably be assumed to, that you could have acquired by the time you're applying to Oxford. So in other words, we're not going to test you on stuff that you would only have come across at the very end of your A-levels, because you won't be at the very end of your A-levels, and that wouldn't be fair. But it's a good idea to work out what sort of things you might need to know. So here on the left, we've got an example from French where you would have to complete some of those sentences. This is for the MLAT, the Modern Languages Admissions Test. And on the right-hand side, we've got an example from the BMAT, which is for medicine, which is assuming GCSE level chemistry knowledge. Okay. For these tests, they typically publish a syllabus. So for the BMAT, they have published a syllabus. So they will tell you what sorts of science questions can come up. They're not, for example, going to ask you questions about A-level physics, because they can't reasonably assume you're doing A-level physics, but they might ask you about GCSE level physics, in which case you should check out the sorts of questions that could come up, because they will tell you, okay? This is not meant to be a big secret. We're not trying to catch anyone out or trick you. The information's there, you've just got to go and find it, okay? Finally, timing. Don't be a time waster. Time is very much against you in these tests. You know, as mentioned, you have to get through a lot very quickly. Tests like the LNAT for law is frankly an absolute pig of a test. It's really hard. The timing constraints are extraordinary. And here's another example from the TSA, and fairly typical critical thinking question where you're supposed to read a section, comprehend it, and then answer some questions. What I would very strongly advise is that you do not start by reading the long bit of text, but you start by reading the question. Which one of the following, if true, most strengthens the above argument? Because once you've read the question, you then know what you're hunting for in this big block of text. What people tend to do is they read the big block of text, then they read the question, then they have to read the big block of text again. It's a total waste of time. You've just lost a lot of very, very valuable seconds, and you really don't want to do that, so don't do that, okay? Think about how you can maximize your time with little tricks like that, okay? And this will all come with practice, so that's why you've got to practice. Okay, strategies for longer answers. Right, now this is going to sound downright patronizing. I don't mean it to be. I just really want to impress on you how important this is. Please do as you are told. A lot of people, when they're asked to write essays, take it as an opportunity to show off how much stuff they know, or to go off piste and perhaps challenge the basis of the question, perhaps sort of show off some thinking skills around the question, and what they're not actually doing is answering the question. That is alarmingly common. So for the TSA essay that I'm most familiar with, I would say a good 40-50% of test takers don't actually answer the question. They don't provide a solution to the puzzle at hand. And that means I have to give them a low mark. So please, for goodness sake, do as you are instructed. These essays are not opportunities for you to just show off all of the facts you might know that are vaguely relevant to the question. They are opportunities for you to show how well you can argue a point, okay? And in some instances, you'll be given quite specific instructions. So this top example comes from the BMAT. Our belief in any particular natural law cannot have a safer basis than our unsuccessful critical attempts to refute it, Karl Popper. Now, you do not need to know who Karl Popper was. You do not need to start sort of expostulating on Popper's theories and show off all the stuff you might know about falsifiability or anything else to do with Popper. All you need to do, and they've set out the instructions here, is explain what this statement means, number one. Argue to the contrary that science may not proceed by attempting to refute hypotheses, number two. To what extent do you think the statement accurately reflects the nature of scientific method, number three. You must do all of those three things. If you do not do all of those three things, you will not get a good mark, okay? And that is incredibly common, that people just fail to actually follow the instructions, and it's just a terrible idea, okay? Relatedly, below we've got a question from the history test, the HAT test. And this question is, what does this text, so you're given a long historical source, a piece of text, and what does this text tell us about religion, culture, education, and everyday life among the Kazakhs? Now, your essay therefore needs to speak to religion, culture, education, and everyday life, right? And if you're not speaking to those elements, you're not answering their question, okay? So you've got to make sure that you're tailored to the question. It's a very good idea, therefore, to reuse the question wording. Don't introduce loads of synonyms, just answer the question directly and fully, because then you'll be doing as you're told, okay? Again, as I say, I don't want to be patronizing, but it is incredibly common for people to just not do what they're supposed to do. And somewhat related to that, and I've already mentioned this, is that these essays are not tests of what you know, nor are they tests of what you believe necessarily. So here are some examples from the TSA for the Thinking Skills Assessment. So should people be free to live in any country they wish to? Now, you do not need to be an expert in asylum law, in international refugee politics, or anything like that. You just need to provide a reasoned argument. If you do happen to know some facts that you think can help illustrate a point, fine. I mean, that's not going to do you any particular harm, but what you are not expected to demonstrate is knowledge. That's not the test. It's a thinking skills assessment. It's not a knowledge assessment, okay? So far more important than your knowledge is your argument. And your argument needs to be clear, clean, and easy to follow, okay? I've got a video on how to write a TSA essay specifically, so do check that out if you haven't already. But make sure it's clearly structured, make sure you've planned what you're going to say before you're going to say it. Make sure there is an answer. You're not sitting on a fence, you're actually answering. So should people be free to live in any country they wish to, your choices are yes or no, with some elaboration, okay? No maybes, unless your maybe comes with some clear distinctions as to when it should be yes and when it should be no, okay? Don't fudge, don't evade, answer the question, right? You're not a politician, so don't act like a politician. Answer the question, all right? Okay. And don't get too hung up about what you may or may not know. It doesn't really matter. You also don't need to worry too much about what you believe, right? You just need to show that you can argue a point. You don't need to actually believe in what you argue. I know that sounds terribly mercenary of me, but it doesn't matter, right? You're not going to be, hauled up in front of a lie detector and sort of forced to testify that you believe every word you say, because it's just not necessary, right? So just make an argument is the only important thing in that test. Okay, so finally, some habits, some things to maximize your chances on any admissions test. First of all, it's all about little and often, I would suggest. Don't, for example, set yourself the onerous task of doing a full-on mock exam every weekend or something, because chances are you'll hate that and you won't do it. Okay, you've got to think about your motivations, what's going to get you through this so that you can do as much preparation as possible. And little and often tends to be the best. Be disciplined, 15, 20 minutes every day, just a little chunk. And don't work on it, by which I mean don't call it work. So when you're doing your 15 or 20 minutes and you've got it in your diary so you know it's coming up each day, it's not going to be work. You're not working on your admissions test, you're just having some fun with it, right? You reframe it in your mind as something enjoyable. This is quite a good sort of general trick to play with yourself. A lot of people, when they do homework, they hate it because they feel like they're doing it for someone else. They're alienated from the work. It's not for them, it's for their teacher, it's for their parents, it's for someone else's benefit. If you reframe things not as work but as study or as training or as learning, then it's all about you and you're much more likely to enjoy it and you're much more likely to do it. So if you think of your 15-20 minutes of admissions test prep as a bit like doing a crossword puzzle or a word search or a Sudoku, it's like a brain teaser that you're just going to round off the day with. No stress, you're just going to see how it goes. You might get some right, you might get some wrong. It's a bit of fun. The more you can think of it as a bit of fun, the more likely you'll do it, the more questions you'll get through, the better prepared you'll be, the stronger you'll become. People who are having fun, generally speaking, do everything in life better than people who are not having fun. So try not to work on the admissions tests, try to enjoy them. As mad as that may sound, you are capable of reframing in your mind in that sort of way, okay? Confront the F word, failure. Remember what I said earlier about psychological preparation. You're going to get some questions wrong, and that's not because you're a bad person, it's not because you're stupid, it's just because the questions are really hard, and it's just because you need more practice. Okay? Practice, 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 you'll get better. You'll be astonished how quickly you'll get better as well. You'll very quickly start to notice patterns in the types of questions that come up and the way that those questions are framed, and you'll get better. I promise you. Just turn up, you'll get better. All right? It's very important. And finally, get going. Start as soon as possible, right? Don't delay. Don't sort of say, right, I'm going to do that later, because 15, 20 minutes, everyone's got that time in their day, right? And you just need some access to some of these resources and you can get started. So get going now, right? Don't procrastinate, just start. You'll be amazed how once you start on a task, you'll be compelled to finish it. It's called the Zeigarnik effect. It's a psychological syndrome. It's been recognized that starting something is the hardest part. So just start, and you'll get going, all right? Anyway, there we go. That's a quick old romp through all of the admissions tests we use. Hopefully that's been of some use. Let me know if you have any specific questions. I will get around to answering any comments that are not too unkind, but most of them are very kind, so that's fine. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you soon. All the best. Bye now.